Welcome everybody to our discussion today. I'm Angela Stent. I'm director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. And I would like to thank the Chevron Corporation for their support of our Central Asian programming. So I am delighted today to welcome one of our series graduates, Professor Brianne Todd, who will be speaking about Kazakhstan today. She's an assistant professor of Central Asian Studies at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies within the National Defense University. And there she focuses on transnational threats and regional security issues in Central Asia. So in addition to developing and facilitating NESA's center programs about the countries of Central Asia, Professor Todd regularly lectures on Central Asia, and she does advise the US and foreign governments, officials and military officers on issues, again, related to security issues in Central Asia. And she splits her time currently between the NESA Center and the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, focusing on this part of the world. And she is also an adjunct assistant professor in the Security Studies program here at Georgetown University. She is completing a PhD dissertation at St. Andrews University, where she's writing about the making of Central Asian policy in the US government. But as I said, she is a graduate of the series program. I remember vividly her capstone presentation about the Nazarbayev family that she presented at the end of her degree. So I am really looking forward to what she has to say. The title of her talk today is Kazakhstan as the Epicenter of Great Power Competition. So we're delighted to have you.
Thank you, Dr. Stent. It is my pleasure to be back with series and at Georgetown University. It's been a few years, but it's always good to be back. I will start by trying to pull up a presentation here. And as I do that, say that all the views that I'm about to express today are my own. So please don't take them as views of the US government, the National Defense University, the Department of Defense, or even Georgetown University. So just want to put that out there from the beginning. The thesis for my presentation today is that insofar as we are in an era of great power competition, Kazakhstan is the epicenter where major powers' interests collide. And I think there has been a lot of talk in Washington over the last several years, certainly during the Trump administration, about great power competition. This was certainly a phrase du jour for much of the foreign policy establishment here. And as a result, you've gotten a lot of the focus on a particular issue, a particular country, and great power competition. But I think it's been really overlooked insofar as Central Asia is concerned, and specifically in regards to Kazakhstan. And when you look at, why Kazakhstan, I think it has largely to do with the fact that it has long borders with Russia and China. Its border with Russia is 4,750 miles long. Its border with China is more than 1,000 miles long. Kazakhstan itself is more than 4 times the size of Texas. So when we're looking at, this size of territory in the Eurasian landmass, certainly Kazakhstan has interests. And I think its interests are maintaining its sovereignty. This year, Kazakhstan is celebrating 30 years of independence, much like the other countries in Central Asia. Maintaining its sovereignty and its independence is a priority. Its stability. In 2019, we saw President Nazarbayev step down and President Tokayev come into power. So maintaining stability in the country is certainly a priority as well. And of course, its territorial integrity, as I mentioned, with its borders. So among all the external actors, certainly the United States, China, and Russia have interests as well. And I think these interests come down to security and economic interests. Natural resources, of course, we have oil and natural gas, but also various metals that are mined in Kazakhstan. We see that Kazakhstan serves as a transit to other markets. If it's China trying to get to markets in the Middle East and Europe. And then, of course, there are a number of regional organizations and multilateral fora that also work with Kazakhstan. For the United States, it's C5+1. That's the forum that we use to work with many of our partners in Central Asia, including Kazakhstan. You also have the NATO Partnership for Peace Consortium, of which Kazakhstan is a member. The European Union has its own interests and a strategy for Central Asia, and of course, the OSCE as well. For Russia, you have the Collective Security Treaty Organization and the Eurasian Economic Union, which I'll get into in a little bit, as well as for China, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So what are US interests in Kazakhstan? You know, when we talk about things like great power competition, why is the US interested in Kazakhstan in the first place? Well, we currently have a 2019 Central Asia strategy, which should serve as our guidance for the region, including Kazakhstan through 2025. And as you see, many of the goals in this strategy work to strengthen both the sovereignty and independence of the countries in the region, also working for the stability and connectivity with Afghanistan. One of the criticisms of this strategy is often that it focuses too much on Afghanistan. Some of the experts in Kazakhstan have noted that 3 out of the 6 points in the Central Asia strategy are really about Afghanistan, making them wonder how much of it is really about Central Asia. I would say that actually our interests in Central Asia and in Kazakhstan have been fairly consistent over the last 30 years. And that even though Afghanistan is singled out by name in the 2019 strategy, what we've seen with this engagement with the region and our interests in the region has been fairly consistent over time. I mean, many of these initiatives and these goals are not new. If you go back to the first Central Asia strategy in the early 90s, which is now declassified and available online, you see that much of these initiatives, such as rule of law reform and respect for human rights, strengthening and maintaining sovereignty and independence, those have been fairly consistent goals over time. So some of the different initiatives that we've done in support of US interests include the Enhanced Strategic Partnership Dialogue. This was an elevation of the bilateral relationship back in 2018. And over time, this has grown. The most recent meeting was a virtual meeting in December. You can see the picture here on Zoom. And really, this has expanded the amount of activity and the depth of the relationship between the United States and Kazakhstan. This has really been an accentuation of some of the in-person visits that we've seen over time. President Nazarbayev visited the United States in January 2018 and met with President Trump at the White House. Undersecretary of State David Hale visited Nur-Sultan in August 2019. And as recently as February 2020, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo also visited Kazakhstan. So really, this is a continuation of some of these high-level visits and some of the different initiatives that have been, initiated by the State Department and the Foreign Ministry in Kazakhstan. Along those lines, I would say that over the past year, a lot of our different work has focused on the pandemic and cooperating in support of the various initiatives in the region. The United States has provided over $6 million in COVID relief, including in the form of personal protective equipment and technical training and assistance. Over the last 20 years, we've provided something along the lines of $2 billion in assistance to Kazakhstan. So it's a fairly consistent and fairly robust relationship. Along the lines of economic development, most recently in January 2021, there was an announcement that the Development Finance Corporation, DFC, was going to cooperate with the Astana International Finance Center in Kazakhstan, as well as the government of Uzbekistan, to create the Central Asia Investment Partnership. And really, this is a fund that hopes to raise $1 billion over the next 5 years to support various initiatives in the region and to continue to mobilize additional funding and resources for private industry and various other related projects in the region. Something that I really focus on in my own work is the bilateral security cooperation. And this is something that the United States has also been very active in over the past 30 years in our relationship with Kazakhstan. We continue to provide support for regional security and stability through our security cooperation programs. One of the best initiatives that we have is our professional military education. It's taken a bit of a hit over the past year due to the pandemic, but for many years, we've had students from Kazakhstan coming to study in US military academies and service schools. And that's been a great addition to our schools here in the United States and provided excellent professional development opportunities for Kazakhstani officers. We're also working on a number of institutional capacity building initiatives to include supporting Kazakhstan's development of its UN peacekeeping operations. They currently have a unit deployed to Lebanon as part of a UNIFIL mission, and we continue to support that. We're also working with them on sustainment and maintenance technical training, as well as English language training. Border security and defense also remain a priority for Kazakhstan. And to that end, both countries are very proud of the fact that in December, the State Department approved the sale of 2 King Air B-300ER Scorpion aircraft that have intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities that Kazakhstan hopes to use for surveilling and using for its border security operations. This will help them deter regional threats and conduct their border security operations. So that was a $128 million purchase that Kazakhstan made with its own funds. That wasn't something the United States gave to Kazakhstan, which indicates that there is real interest in continuing to develop military cooperation with the United States. I mentioned earlier that the format that we use for much of our engagement with Central Asia is the C5+1 forum. This was an initiative that was started in 2015 under former Secretary of State John Kerry and continues, as I mentioned most recently, with the visit of Secretary Pompeo to Central Asia. In this picture, he's in Tashkent for the ministerial meeting, but he also visited Kazakhstan on that visit. What would be really great is to continue to see this grow during the Biden administration, to see additional foreign ministry meetings in the C5+1 format, but also a meeting of the defense ministers as well. It's been noted that there's never been a visit by a US president to the region or to Kazakhstan even specifically, although we often overlook the fact that there has been a vice president visit to the region. In 2006, Vice President Dick Cheney and his wife visited Kazakhstan and were actually met at the airport by current President Tokayev. Something that gets forgotten, but that's one visit in 30 years. I think that there's certainly room for us to develop that relationship and to continue to grow these high-level meetings and to expand that cooperation. So some of Russia's interests in Kazakhstan, I will just very briefly outline Russia and China's interests because I certainly want to get to the discussion where we can elaborate on these questions in more detail. So Russia has often looked at Kazakhstan as part of its sphere of privileged interests, which is kind of the periphery countries, if you will, in Central Asia, which were part of the former Soviet space. Kazakhstan, much like its neighbors in Central Asia, shares historical, cultural, linguistic, political, and security ties with Russia, dating back to the Soviet era. Those are all maintained, as well as elaborated on in the fields of trade and energy. One of the areas that Kazakhstan really looks to Russia for is its military technical cooperation. A lot of the equipment that Kazakhstan uses is legacy equipment from Russia, and as a result, a lot of the sustainment and maintenance that we're currently working with them on is Russian provided equipment. I mentioned the Collective Security Treaty Organization. So Kazakhstan was one of the original members of the CSTO. It's been a member since 1994 when this organization went into effect under the Collective Security Treaty. Interestingly enough, Kazakhstan has never had a Secretary General of the CSTO. Of the 6 Secretary Generals, 4 of them have been from Russia. I think one's been from Belarus and one from Armenia, but Kazakhstan has never been represented in the leadership. That said, it does have very close ties with the CSTO. There was recently a meeting between the current Secretary General and the Kazakh Minister of Defense, and they discussed the fact that in the year 2022, so hopefully post-pandemic, there will be 3 military exercises conducted on Kazakhstan's territory under the auspices of the CSTO. The other project that Kazakhstan's involved with Russia on is the Eurasian Economic Union. This is an organization that is often attributed to Vladimir Putin as it being his idea, but actually the idea for it, this customs union along the lines of the former countries of the Soviet space, actually was the idea of President Nazarbayev. He proposed it in a 1994 speech at Moscow State University. So really it was his idea to begin with. And Kazakhstan was one of the original founding members, along with Belarus and Russia, when it was really this idea of a regional trading bloc. Of course, it's grown over time and now has Armenia and Kyrgyzstan as members as well. It has been in effect since January 2015. Right now, Kazakhstan actually holds the presidency. This year in 2021, Kazakhstan and the head of state, President Tokayev, are in charge of the Eurasian Economic Union. I think that's something that's currently somewhat overlooked, due mostly, in fact, to the pandemic and the fact that everyone is so preoccupied with that. There hasn't been an opportunity for a lot of in-person engagement as a result. So some of China's interests in Central Asia. So I think it really comes down to China's domestic interests and how those potentially bleed over into the region. Certainly for China, its western border is the issue that it is most concerned about, and really containing the ethnic Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Now, the Uyghurs are an issue that we can discuss in the Q&A if that's of interest, but certainly because there are ties across the border with some of the population in Central Asia, it's a very sensitive subject for the countries in Central Asia, including Kazakhstan, and as a result, not something that they really publicly want to discuss, but are certainly willing to work with China on behind the scenes. China is also very interested in economic expansion through its Belt and Road Initiative, and I'll expand upon that here in some of the next slides. I mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So this was an organization that originally started out as the Shanghai Five with some of the countries in Central Asia. And the original mandate was actually very much focused on security, really countering terrorism, extremism, and separatism. Over time, as you can see from this map, it has grown considerably. It is now the largest regional security organization in the world in terms of both area covered and population. But as a result, the agenda has somewhat changed over time as well. I think it is now focused less on security principally and become more of an economically, socially driven bloc as a result. But as I mentioned, Kazakhstan was one of the original members along with some of the other countries in Central Asia. So the Belt and Road Initiative, and I love this graphic from Eurasian because I love the fact that they describe Kazakhstan as the buckle and the Belt and Road Initiative. I think that that's very appropriate because when you see that China's aspiration is really to get to markets in Europe and the Middle East, certainly Central Asia and a lot of its projects in Kazakhstan specifically really do fit the role of being the buckle and the belt. What's interesting is that it's kind of a mixed bag for the countries in Central Asia and particularly Kazakhstan. They're very proud of the fact that when this was first announced, the Belt and Road Initiative, when it was initially the One Belt, One Road Initiative, It was when President Xi came to Astana in 2013 and made a speech at Nazarbayev University. That was really when he launched this initiative. Over time, it's met with mixed reception. Obviously, China has put a lot of money and a lot of time into investment and infrastructure projects in Kazakhstan. But as a result of that, there's not a lot of transparency. I mean, much of what is going on in the country is going on behind the scene and with the leadership between the two countries. So the population doesn't have a lot of visibility on this. So as a result, there are somewhat mixed feelings about China's presence in Kazakhstan. And as a result, there's a bit of a pushback in the fact that, is this really the kind of the golden egg that it seems to be, in the sense of certainly China wouldn't just be putting all this money into Kazakhstan for, a sense of goodwill. So there must be another, ask coming somewhere farther down the line. And I think that is the concern that a lot of citizens in Kazakhstan have, is what is it that China is going to want as a result of making this major investment in Kazakhstan? So some of the particular projects that are going on in the region, specific to Kazakhstan, are the pipelines. So you have the Kazakhstan-China oil pipeline, which is partially owned by the China National Petroleum Company, CNPC, and also Kazmunai Gas, which transports oil from Kazakhstan to China. Right now, I think it's about 400,000 barrels per day coming out of Kashagan. You also have the Central Asia-China gas pipeline, which actually comes out of Turkmenistan but transits through Kazakhstan and also gets some gas out of Kazakhstan that way. When it gets to the Chinese border, it links up with the West-East pipeline. The other major project for Kazakhstan and China is Horgos, the dry port on the border between Kazakhstan and China. There was a lot of trade going on at that border pre-COVID. During COVID, it slowed down considerably. Much of that had to do with border closures and the fact that for a time early last spring, right after the pandemic was really officially acknowledged by both the World Health Organization and a lot of the countries in the region, there was a halt put on the export of cereals and cereal grains and other foods coming out of Kazakhstan. So for instance, the Eurasian Economic Union stopped exports. Kazakhstan itself stopped exports. So that's the export of soybeans, wheat, rye, buckwheat. So a lot of those goods were no longer going into China. When Kazakhstan reopened its border in July, China did not open its side of the border. So there were a lot of trucks backed up at the China-Kazakhstan border on the Kazakhstan side. Since about October, China has started letting trucks through again, but not nearly to meet with the demand. I think there's something like 100 trucks a day, but they're only letting in about 20 to 30. So as a result, you get a backup on the Kazakhstan side of the border. And that's posing some real issues for the supply chain for Kazakhstan, in the sense of it has these goods that it wants to get to market, and especially some of these perishable food items. That's becoming somewhat problematic. So what are some of the potential implications for the United States and Kazakhstan? We talk about all the interests of these major actors and how this plays out when we look at great power competition. So of course, we are now in the Biden administration, and one of the issues is, are we going to continue to talk about great power competition, or was that really a phrase of the Trump administration? I think the dynamics are going to remain, but we might see them reframed and in a different vocabulary used. For example, we might see more of, emphasis placed on working with some of our partners and allies. I think there's still going to be an emphasis placed on countering China, but I haven't heard as much about Russia. For what this means for Kazakhstan, I think for the most part, we're going to continue to have relations that are on a steady, consistent trajectory. Everything that I've seen indicates that we will continue to do many of the things that we've been doing. We have a 5-year plan for security cooperation with Kazakhstan. We have the enhanced strategic partnership dialogue. All of these initiatives will continue. So that's one path. Another potential path is because of this increased emphasis on diplomacy that we've seen come out in this interim security guidance that the Biden administration released last week, we might see more emphasis on working with our partners and allies, and as a result, more cooperation with countries like Kazakhstan. Although I think we do have to be mindful of issues like bandwidth. Kazakhstan has a lot of partners, and not just the United States, Russia, and China. It is very active relations with countries in the Gulf, including the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, but you also have countries like Turkey, India, Pakistan, Iran, Japan, lots of countries that are interested in working with Kazakhstan. So the US is just one actor. And I don't know that Kazakhstan has the bandwidth to do more with the United States. On the other hand, if we don't do as much, I think there will be this perception that the US is disinterested. Certainly, as we've been having these conversations about withdrawing troops from Afghanistan by the 1st of May, there's been this perception that the United States is abandoning the region. We aren't abandoning the region. I think our relations with the countries in Central Asia and Kazakhstan specifically are going to continue in the long term, separate from what's going on in Afghanistan. But I think similarly, there is somewhat of a disinterest by Kazakhstan in working with the United States. Insofar as we continue to pressure them on things like rule of law reform and human rights, I think that will only cause them to grow closer to countries like Russia and China. And so ultimately, I think it comes down to how much is Kazakhstan willing to do with the United States. And that is separate from issues related to bandwidth and personnel and resourcing, but just how much are they willing to do without getting pressure from their neighbor to the north and their neighbor to the southeast. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very informative presentation. I encourage people to use the Q&A function for their questions. So let me start off actually where you ended. If you look at the great power competition in Kazakhstan, it is asymmetrical. I mean, Russia has very immediate political and economic interests in Kazakhstan, in Central Asia. China, of course, has very immediate, as you've described, economic interests and also political interests there. The US, as you also said, largely since 2001 at least, has been active there because of Afghanistan. So once we do withdraw, I guess two questions. One of them is, what really are the incentives for the United States to remain involved in the area, and particularly in Kazakhstan? In the 90s, before 9/11, it had to do with obviously security and independence and sovereignty, and also with oil and gas. The oil and gas part of that is, looks different now as we go towards a world where that's going to be less important. So that's one question. Why would the U.S. want to remain so involved there? And then the second one is, how about the Russian-Chinese competition in Central Asia and in Kazakhstan? Obviously, both countries officially keep reiterating that there is no competition. But do you think, how do you see that part of it?
Those are great questions. So the incentives for the United States, I think, first of all, the idea of us leaving Afghanistan and no longer having interests related to security, I disagree with that. I think security is going to continue to be an issue for all of Central Asia, but including Kazakhstan. Something that's not widely reported, but if you go back and really dig into the local press, there's been a number of arrests over the past year during the pandemic, which has been taking up everyone's attention, of different extremist elements around Kazakhstan, everything from Mangistau in the west to Almaty in the south. So certainly the domestic threat remains in the sense of this is something that concerns the government, and we certainly want to work with them on that. But also the border security issues. As I mentioned, this is something that we are working with Kazakhstan on. I think we're going to continue to do a lot of training in this area and help them build capacity in that field, the countering of narcotics and other regional trafficking threats. So certainly the security threats will remain, and that will be something that we want to work with Kazakhstan on, rather than just kind of abandoning them or walking away from the investments that we've made over the past 30 years. I think that that is going to continue to be a lot of our security focus, at least. And also too, you mentioned the oil and gas. I think that there is increasingly a push, and I think we're going to see this under the Biden administration, to help Kazakhstan diversify their economy. I think that this is something that we are interested in assisting them insofar as Kazakhstan wants our assistance. Certainly that is something that is going to be up to them to decide. But I agree with you. I think for now, maybe more of a security focus, but certainly potential for economic. For the Russia-Chinese competition, this is very interesting. And certainly Kazakhstan is probably the best positioned for this issue. I think that the Russian security interests are certainly at play in Kazakhstan, and we see the very close military cooperation going on there. There's been something of an assumption, I think, on the US's part that China is not interested in engaging in security issues in Central Asia. I disagree with that very strongly. I think that China definitely has security interests in Central Asia, and also doesn't trust Russia or the countries in Central Asia to take care of those security interests. So I think we are going to see an increased Chinese security presence in Kazakhstan, and how that will be negotiated with Russia will be interesting. I have heard from Central Asians that there seems to be this perception that Russia and China have kind of this unspoken agreement between themselves as far as how they will divide these areas, the security interests, the economic interests. I disagree. I don't think there's any agreement between Russia and China. I think that China is going to do what China wants to do, and Russia's not going to really be able to stop them. But ultimately, this puts Kazakhstan in a very difficult position because they will be left to have to balance these partners. Of course, the US is much more geographically removed from this equation, so the amount of cooperation that we're doing is less of an issue. But certainly, as they have borders with both Russia and China, they're going to be facing very intense pressure from both of those neighbors.
So, the first one we have actually is a comment from Ambassador Richard Hoagland saying that Vice President Gore visited Central Asia in 1994. This had to do with what you were saying about high-level visits. Then we have a question from Sarah Nickel. Can you talk about how the US sees the Eurasian Economic Union? From my understanding, the US has not officially recognized it, and therefore it doesn't have diplomatic relations or engagement as it is developing its regulations and policies. Is there an opportunity or possibility for US engagement on that front, especially in light of Kazakhstan's presidency this year?
So great point by Ambassador Hoagland about Vice President Gore's visit in 1994. Thank you for correcting me. I appreciate that. To Sarah's question about the Eurasian Economic Union. So that is a great question. And I think that that is something that the US would be interested in if we were allowed to have observer status. Certainly we can ask, but I would frankly not be very optimistic that it would be granted to us. Now, this is something where I think we could really work with our partners in the region and provide support. And certainly there's no reason for all of us to be doing parallel efforts when we could be working together. But as a result of that, Russia is obviously going to have a voice in that conversation. And I don't see Russia wanting the United States to be involved in the Eurasian Economic Union, regardless of what any of the other countries have or an interest in. So even if Kazakhstan were to say, yes, we want the US to be an observer or to be a part of this discussion because they have the presidency, frankly, I just don't see Russia allowing that to happen. I could be overly pessimistic in that regard, but I'm trying to be pragmatic, I think.
Okay, our next question is from Peter Zwack. From your perspective, how strong does Russia's soft power, language, cultural, business influence remain in Kazakhstan? Is Russian language diminishing? Is there a concern, not publicly vocal in Moscow, that Chinese business and cultural creep in Kazakhstan and the region is going to subsume Russian interests? Or is Kazakhstan canny enough to balance both in its own interests?
Great question by General Zwack. So Russian soft power, I think, is certainly continues to be an issue. I think we see it mostly in the media. A lot of Russian media still in Kazakhstan, a lot of influence in that way. The Russian language, I think it really depends on where you are. And certainly depending on if you're in Nur-Sultan or Almaty or even some of the other cities, you might get more of the Russian or even English. But I think once you get outside of the major cities, how much you see of that these days, I frankly don't know. The Chinese influence, I think, yes, that certainly does concern Russia. And it probably should, because China is investing a significant amount of money both into Kazakhstan, but also in bringing individuals from Kazakhstan to China. A lot of students being funded, a lot of effort being put into teaching them Chinese and being educated at Chinese universities. All of that, I think we won't see the immediate impact of for several years. Like, it will be more of a long-term trend over time where we will see how much Chinese soft power really competes with Russian soft power. And I also wouldn't discount English in this scenario either, because I think that there is a large number of individuals that are also studying English. So I think that the US soft power is there and has potential, but I don't want to equate US soft power necessarily with English language ability, because while individuals might know English, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have a positive inclination towards the United States. So I want to be cautious about equating those things. And similarly, I think even with the Russian soft power, individuals might know Russian, but not necessarily have a very positive view towards Russia in certain circumstances. For example, as recently as December, you had Russian lawmakers making very inflammatory remarks about the territorial integrity of Kazakhstan. You know, that it had their land had essentially been a gift from Russia to Kazakhstan. If you are a Kazakh and you know your history and know things like the rebellion of Kenesari Kasimov and the Alish Orda and the crush of the Alish autonomy and the role that Russia played in your history and how violent it was, those are very inflammatory and offensive remarks. So I think, again, we have to be very cautious about equating Russian language ability with positive inclinations towards Russia.
Those are important points. Our next question from Reggie Gibbs. What is Kazakhstan's view of itself? Is it comfortable in its current role as a focal point of great power competition? What is it hoping to achieve strategically for itself in the long term?
It's a great question from Reggie, another series alumni.
Right.
So I think for Kazakhstan, its view of itself continues to be that it is a regional leader in Central Asia. I think too that it has interests in almost perpetuating this idea of great power competition because it gives it strategic importance. If countries aren't competing to work with Kazakhstan, then what is left for Kazakhstan. But because it is very important and many partners want to be there, be present, be doing more with Kazakhstan, it gives Kazakhstan options. The multi-vector foreign policy has been a key part of its engagement over time. It's something that other countries in the region have also started to pick up on as well. But that only works if you have multiple partners that want to engage you. And I think that that is really Kazakhstan's issue at this point, is maintaining that balance between being competitive and having partners that want to work with Kazakhstan, but not so much that they're getting a lot of pressure from those partners, right? So they don't want to have to choose among partners and be forced into choosing kind of the first among equals, if you will. So I think for Kazakhstan, it's setting its own course. That is really how it sees itself right now. They're at a point where they are almost politically mature, after 30 years of independence, a transition from President Nazarbayev to President Tokayev, and kind of setting the course for the future.
Great. Next question from Grace Kia. How, if at all, will the Biden administration's explicit focus on the importance of democracy affect the US's relationship with Kazakhstan?
Another great question. And frankly, I think at this point, it's too soon to tell, but it's something that certainly is probably going to be a topic of conversation behind the scenes for many of our representatives from the State Department. Certainly, we know from the Obama administration, of which President Biden was a member, that human rights, rule of law, democratization are very important issues, and have pretty much always been part of US foreign policy. How much this administration will choose to emphasize those issues, I think remains to be seen. We don't know yet kind of how we're really going to approach Central Asia. And as we really review some of our options, specifically in regards to Afghanistan, I think that will maybe have some third order effects for how we engage some of our partners in the region. But certainly that will continue to be part of the discussion, whether that's overtly in public. I don't want to say the naming and shaming, because that doesn't tend to go over very well with our partners in the region. And our relationship with Kazakhstan is almost too mature for that. Like, I think we're beyond that point where we need to publicly embarrass each other over these kinds of issues. Like, I think we now have the kind of rapport where we can have those discussions. But if that is something that the Biden administration chooses to prioritize, how that message is conveyed, I think will be really important.
Okay, the next question from Tatiana Payak. With regard to Kazakhstan's interest in dealing with the United States, the US is the only partner that lists Kazakhstan's territorial integrity as one of its priorities. This is notably missing from Russia's and China's. How do you think this factors in Kazakhstan's interest in closer partnership with the United States and in the dynamic between Russia and China?
No, that's a great question. And, I think territorial integrity is one of these issues that is often overlooked and even somewhat mocked in the US strategy. Like, that's a rather silly thing. But as I mentioned, if you're a citizen of Kazakhstan and you know your history and you know the history between Russia and the conquest and colonization of Central Asia, territorial integrity is a key issue. And I think the fact that the US chooses to emphasize that sends a very strong signal to our partner in the sense of we respect that for Kazakhstan. If I were to make a recommendation to Russia and China, I would recommend that they do the same. And I think you make an excellent point when you say that is noticeably missing from those respective relationships, that they don't reinforce those concepts, which is interesting because the border issue has been very provocative over time. Certainly as we've seen the countries in the region work on finalizing their borders, there have been issues with China in that regard. So territorial integrity, I think, is a very important issue for Kazakhstan. I think it's right that we continue to emphasize that in the US strategy. And I think it's going to continue to be an important issue for Kazakhstan.
Okay. So the next question has to do with the Eurasian Economic Union and US involvement in it. Recently, Dmitry Kozak was appointed as a third deputy of Russia's presidential administration. He oversees relations with the Central Asian countries. It's widely believed that Mr. Kozak will use more aggressive approach to integrate Kazakhstan's economy into Russia. And it's also believed that the Kremlin will ask Accorda to move American bases from the Caspian Sea and remove American companies from Kazakhstan's oil business. Do you think that Kazakhstan will be able to resist this? And would the US be able, if willing, to stop this?
A very interesting question. So first of all, the bases on the Caspian and American businesses in Kazakhstan. So frankly, I think, yes, Kazakhstan would be able to resist this. Granted, Dmitry Kozak has a long history and, very experienced diplomat, knows all of the players in Kazakhstan. But on the other hand, Kazakhstan knows Dmitry Kozak as well. And I think that this is one of these issues where if you're Kazakhstan, you have to take a stand, right? If you're going to really support this multi-vector foreign policy, you can't allow any one of your partners to come in and say you have to stop doing business and kick out the other partners' companies from your country. So to allow Russia to come in and say they need to remove US companies from Kazakhstan would give Russia an extraordinary amount of power over Kazakh business, Kazakh political interests. If I were to make a recommendation to the Kazakh government, my US affiliation aside, I would strongly discourage that. And not just because it's involving the US and Russia. I think for any of their partners to allow that would be, would really cross a red line for Kazakhstan.
Okay. Next question from Evarista Kapala. And this has to do with, yes, perceptions of the Chinese in Kazakhstan. You mentioned the wariness of Kazakhstani citizens regarding China. Considering past concerns, such as the land purchase issue, the treatment of ethnic Kazakhs in Xinjiang, how has Nur Sultan responded to local anti-Chinese sentiments with respect to its pursuit of closer cooperation with Beijing?
Great question. And the answer is probably not as well as they could. For instance, I think the Uyghur issue is something that is really going to continue to plague Kazakhstan. Aside from getting a lot of international pressure from countries like the United States, like I mentioned last year when Secretary Pompeo visited, that was one of the key issues that he really wanted to talk about was the mistreatment of the Uyghurs in China. I think it made the Kazakh government very uncomfortable to have that discussion in an open forum. But to have that discussion with their own citizens then is also a very difficult conversation for the Kazakh government and leadership there. So I think that issue is going to continue to plague them until they come to some kind of stance. Right now, it seems to be to just say nothing for fear of offending China. But certainly, I don't think that resonates well with the population because certainly the Uyghur issue, there are citizens in Kazakhstan that have family members in China. We've seen a number of cases where individuals have come to Kazakhstan seeking asylum. That is going to continue, I think, to be an issue for them. You mentioned the land reform. I know that they're trying to pass some laws to address that, but I think all of these perceptions of China, glossing over them and just trying to assure everyone that working with China is in Kazakhstan's best interest, I don't think really gets to the root of the problem. And I don't think really assures the population that China is necessarily a good partner for Kazakhstan.
Okay, and our next question has to do with domestic politics in Kazakhstan. Could you talk a little bit about who might follow Tokayev and the enduring influence of Nazarbayev, his family and elites with close connections to Russia?
So I am not going to be so bold as to make any guesses as to who will follow President Tokayev since he was just elected in 2019. To try and undermine his current mandate, I feel might be a bit tricky there. But who comes next? That is a great question. This was the object of much speculation when President Nazarbayev was in power, as far as who would succeed him. There was a lot of talk about one of his family members, one of his daughters, and that didn't happen. Now, certainly his daughter has been active in the government, has been in and out of government, in and out of positions of power within the government. His son-in-law is still very powerful within industry and business in Kazakhstan. So I don't want to say that the Nazarbayev family couldn't rise again, because certainly that is always a possibility. I think you should never discount anyone when it comes to Kazakhstani politics. But that said, I think right now, the focus for President Tokayev is to get Kazakhstan through the current crisis, through the pandemic, to rebuild the economy, I think is going to be his main struggle, and to really rebuild public trust in the government. We've seen a number of protests for a lot of different issues, the social issues, really. That's been somewhat sidelined during the pandemic, but those issues haven't gone away and people are still dissatisfied. And I think I know I mentioned in my presentation, stability being an issue of importance for the government. It's not just maintaining continuity in leadership, it's really addressing the grievances of the population. So I think regardless of who's in power, that's really what their concern needs to be, is not just maintaining power, but really addressing some of these grievances of citizens.
Alas, we only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to apologize to those of you whose questions didn't get asked, and I'm going to give you one last question from Professor Roger Kangas. In your opinion, how should Kazakhstan manage its relations with Iran, a neighbor to the south? Can it balance this with ties to the US, or simply keep these dynamics separate? And then actually, I'm going to add on another question to this. We're observing some signs of Saudi-Iran rivalry in Central Asia. Are there any such signs in Kazakhstan? Any thoughts on developing Iran-Kazakhstan relations?
So great question. And first of all, the Saudi-Iran issue in Central Asia. So this is often referred to as mosque diplomacy, where you have different countries from the Gulf coming in and building different mosques in different countries. We've seen this at play in Kazakhstan, where you have a number of mosques going up around the country. I don't think most of them have been built by Iran. I think actually most of the major funding has come from the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So I think in the mosque diplomacy in Kazakhstan, Iran is less of a factor there. It is at play in some of the other countries in Central Asia, but less so in Kazakhstan. But the question on how to balance Iran ties with the ties with the United States, that's a great question, and frankly, one that many of the countries in Central Asia are struggling with. Probably just as much in Turkmenistan, because it has a border with Iran, has a lot of cross-border trade, commercial traffic there. And frankly, that is a tough issue for them. As someone who works for the US government, I guess I'm supposed to say, don't do business with Iran because you might get sanctioned. And that is a legitimate concern. There have been a number of sanctions put in place on Russia, China, and Iran over the last several years. CAATSA, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. I don't think any of the countries in Central Asia have been hit hard by that, but there is a possibility that they could, specifically with Iran. And that has been a country that we have had enduring enmity with over many decades. So for Kazakhstan, I guess my advice would be, this is where you use your multi-vector foreign policy, right? Where if you're balancing multiple partners, you have a conversation with the United States and say, look, United States, you are just one of many partners. Iran is also a key partner, and then deal with the consequences accordingly. I think there is a way of having that discussion. And I think, frankly, that is a discussion that needs to be had if it hasn't already been had. Although I'm assuming at this point, it's already been had, because this is something that's been ongoing for a number of years. And certainly the sanction issue has been in place for a number of years as well. Other countries are just choosing to avoid it altogether and are intentionally not doing business with Iran because they don't want to risk that relationship with the United States. So ultimately, that is really a decision for Kazakhstan to have to make as far as if they have to choose, who are they going to choose? And again, we really can't make that decision for Kazakhstan.
Well, thank you. Well, again, with apologies to those of you whose questions I couldn't ask. Every questioner has said thank you for a terrific presentation. So you've had a lot of compliments in the Q&A function, which I haven't read out because we're doing Q&A. So I would like to add my own compliments to that. This was a terrific presentation. We're very glad that you were able to come and speak to us about this very important topic. And we will continue to look to things that you write about this to further inform ourselves. So I'm sure everyone else joins me in thanking you for a very enlightening presentation.